the FANHS Museum board member, treasurer, and also like the team lead for the volunteers here. Everybody's a volunteer. My grandfather, he left the Philippines in 1913, went to Hawaii, worked there for 3 years, and then came to California in 1916. And he had heard of Filipinos working in Salinas, so that's where he went first, to Salinas. Then he came to Stockton in 1917, and he worked for Holt Manufacturing for a couple of years. And he had a lot of jobs, working on the railroad, working as a chauffeur, and of course always working in the fields and following the crops up and down the state of California. The stuff here behind me a lot came from his labor camp, and they bought property in 1930 in the name of his wife's name because of the alien land laws, Asians, and so Filipinos couldn't own land. So his wife was from Spain. They got married, they met here in Stockton and got married in 1924 and didn't have any problems with the anti-miscegenation laws. They got married in the church here in Stockton. And in 1930 they brought property in her name, and we still have that property in the family. My uncle is living there now. And all the equipment and stuff you see here, when the workers went to a camp, usually all they had was a bedroll and a duffel. There was no furniture or anything there, so what they would do is they would get extra slats from the packing crates in the packing sheds, and they'd make furniture, a table, bedside table, a chair, whatever that to make them comfortable. So all of that stuff then was left behind when it came to move, because they would just bring their bedroll, bring their duffel, and go on to the next camp. So since my grandfather eventually became a labor contractor and they had a camp out in Terminus for a period of time, then the furniture and stuff was left there. And then when that was done, especially after the war, when that camp was disbanded, he just brought all this stuff and was stored at the farm. And my uncle one day, about 10 years ago, says, "I'm gonna get rid of this stuff. Do you want it or not?" "Oh yeah, we'll take it for the museum." And so that's why we got all this stuff here. My grandfather, he had a lot of businesses in Little Manila area on El Dorado Street. He had 2 grocery stores, a pool hall, a card club, and eventually the last one was the Quezon Hotel that he got started managing right after the war, and had that until it was torn down for the Crosstown Freeway that came through Stockton and went through Chinatown and the Asian community there, and basically displaced all the people that were living there. In the movie Fat City with Stacy Keach, the opening scene is where they are panning from El Dorado Street up to the hotel and then up to Stacy Keach in the hotel room, and that's my grandfather's hotel. And it was right before it got torn down. So I never went there when they were filming, but my uncle and my cousins were there, and they thought it was an interesting experience. So Little Manila was basically a 4-block area between Lafayette Street, which was now the southern part, actually even a couple of streets south of that, and maybe up to Main Street. And so we're north of Main Street right here. There's now only 2 buildings left that would be considered Little Manila. One is the Mariposa Hotel, and the other now is, now it's a nightclub, but it was a social hall. There were 2 social halls right around the block from each other that were both built by the Jimmy Ente's father, and Jimmy Ente is still alive. And that's where the Filipinos mostly would go when the farm workers came into town, and they would either go to a social club or they would go to a pool hall or whatever, entertainment, go to the restaurants. It's mostly Chinese restaurants. There weren't any Filipino restaurants then, because it was Chinatown, mainly. Nobody called it Little Manila, not until later on. They either called it Chinatown or Skid Row. So it wasn't called Little Manila until later, and then when you start doing all the history and the historians come and write stories and stuff, then they're actually in there was in the 40s, I think, there was Wallace Stegner who wrote One Nation, and it was a series of magazine articles for Life, I think Life magazine. When he came, he was going to all of these different communities across the United States and looking at the different cultures. And so when he was doing something about the Filipinos, he came here. So there was a man named Frank Perez who was a newspaper guy, a reporter, and he showed him all around Stockton. And that's where the poster, "No Filipinos Allowed," comes from. It was originally from that book, One Nation. The photographer took a picture of it while Wallace Stegner and Frank Perez were going around down here. And Frank Perez is the one that called it Little Manila, because he was a newspaper guy from LA, and he was starting to write articles about Filipinos. So he called it Little Manila. That's kind of where it coined, but mostly coined in the LA paper. So it made its way up here eventually. So his wife, Frank Perez's wife, Letty Perez, is still alive. And so she talks about the time when all of that was done. So the Crosstown Freeway, that's basically where Chinatown was. There's a little bit left between Main Street and the Crosstown Freeway. But mostly it was gone. Okay, Stockton was the hub of Filipino-American community because of the agriculture in this area. And Stockton was the biggest town at that time. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, before the war, Stockton was the biggest metropolitan area. So the agriculture out in the Delta, that's where all the Filipinos would be working. When you think about the history, first it was the Japanese out there, and they were creating the levees that created the Delta farm area. But then once immigration laws and stuff, and then once the Spanish-American War, and now the Philippines are nationals, they can come in, no quota. So the United States, hey, you got free labor over there, this is where you go and get them. And California was the largest agricultural area, so they all came here. And then since Stockton was the largest metropolitan area, so when they have their days off or whatever, this is where they could come. This is where they could see other Filipinos. This is where they could have Chinese food. This is where they could go shopping and things. They not necessarily could go. There's stories where they couldn't go north of Main Street, which is down that way, south of us. But they felt comfortable down here. And then once World War II came around, because most of the businesses were Chinese and Japanese. Well, once World War II and the Japanese were interned, then the Filipinos, they got together, 3 or 4 guys would get together and they'd manage a store, they'd manage a club, they'd manage a pool hall, they'd manage a hotel. So then if you notice the businesses, right after World War II started, all the businesses now are being run by Filipinos because the Japanese were taken away. And so that's why then more and more Filipinos would come here. When the guys were working out in the fields, they didn't have a mailing address. So they would use one of the hotels or one of the restaurants or whatever as their mailing address. So when they came into town, they'd go to wherever they had set it up and say, hey, you guys got any mail for me? And the managers or whoever in charge, they would have a box for, the different guys, like own little post office,
Nice.
So this was the hub. And then when they went to other places to go to like Delano and the grapes, or they in Fresno, or they go even over to Idaho and work in the potatoes, or there's orchards, or even up to the Alaskan canneries. Eventually they come back here because they follow the crops, and there's a lot of them here in California, so they would eventually all end up here different times of the year for different times of the crops. So that's why this was the biggest hub, and that's why FANHS decided if they were going to have a national Filipino-American museum, it should be built here in Stockton, because this was the majority of the history, at least here on the West Coast. So they decided that in 1994 to start raising funds to build a museum. So it took 25 years almost for us to get a place to rent. We've been collecting things for 20-something years, and so we were able to put this together. And in 2015 we got the place. 2016 we opened, and we keep rotating exhibits. And the main thing that we enjoy is having students come here and learning, because they're not learning Filipino-American history anywhere else. Ethnic studies started in the 70s, so it's still a new thing in the universities. Only a few universities have had picked it up. It's not in the high schools. They're trying to do that. Washington State got it into the high school curriculum, at least in the Seattle district. Los Angeles is starting to get ethnic studies into the lower grades. So they still need someplace to go to learn all of this. And FANHS is the place that houses it all, basically. They're the ones that did the research. It started in '82, mainly because the bridge generation, which is any Filipino-American born here before 1949, who has at least one parent that emigrated from the Philippines. Well, that bridge generation in 1982 were already in their 60s and 70s, and their parents were gone. And nobody ever recorded the parents' history. Now they're the only ones who know it. So they decided we better start writing this down. And this is Fred and Dorothy Cordova. And so they started this historical society just to get all this information down. And then it became big. And they said, you know what, let's have chapters. So then they started forming chapters so that they wouldn't have to go to Oregon to do the research. They have a chapter there in Oregon. They didn't have to come down to California. They could have a chapter in California doing this. So now, 40 years later, there are 40 chapters across the United States. And all of us are collecting the history in our areas. So there's a Stockton chapter, and the Stockton chapter started in '92. So when this place in '94 was decided to be built, then it was Stockton chapter who kind of had take the reins, because it was here embedded in our city. So that's why it's kind of a dual thing. Stockton chapter people are basically the ones running the museum, but it's a national museum. It's not a Stockton museum. It's a national Filipino-American history museum, and we have different parts of the United States represented here. In some places, because it's still ethnic studies is still being developed across the curriculum across the United States. So it just depends on the area. I know that in California, there was a law passed a couple of years ago with Rob Bonta, who's now the state's attorney general, but he developed a bill that said that the agricultural, whenever the agricultural business history is being discussed in class, it has to include a module about Filipinos. So, so that was something first for here. Like I said, the Washington State, they, FANHS, a couple of the professors that are members of FANHS, they created a curriculum that talks about Filipino-American history in Washington State that has now been adopted for that school district. So little by little, it all depends on the university, what they want to get across. And you know, I mean, obviously, you know, there's a big history about Chinese and big history about the Japanese, and still Filipinos are still kind of lower on the totem pole because, you know, I don't know.
Well, no, we don't put a pressure on.
Yeah.
Going back again to the farm workers, what do you remember, or somebody told you about it, about Watsonville riot?
The Watsonville riots, I only know about from reading it in the newspapers and stuff. I wasn't around then, so, and my family was here already. There were maybe some other, because my grandfather had, his brother came over and some cousins came over also. So, and they did work in Salinas and Watsonville, but they weren't there during the riots. So, it really wasn't something that anybody talked about in my family. It's just what we heard. And then also a lot of stuff I only learned once I joined FANHS in '94. Then I was learning about different things by going to the conferences and stuff, and learning, oh, that's why my grandfather was in Hawaii. That's why my grandfather came here. You know, I learned all that because he never talked about stuff. So we would love everybody to come and check out the FANHS Museum, and you can go to the FANHSmuseum.com website to see our hours. Right now, because of COVID, still we're open by appointment only, and we need some leeway time, but we want you to come down here, check out what we have. We have revolving exhibits, and we have things about what other kinds of works Filipinos did. They not only just in the fields, they were also military, entertainers, they were in business, they were in health. And so don't just think of Filipinos as agricultural workers, stoop labor. They did a lot of stuff. So we want you to come down here and check it out. And this is the place to learn about Filipino-American history. So my name's Terri Torres, and I am the FANHS Museum treasurer, board member, team lead, and I've also a trustee of FANHS. And I've been a lifetime member of the Stockton chapter of FANHS since '95. So Filipinos weren't just agricultural workers, they were also in the business and entertainment and the health field. Like, here's my mother in the middle and my two aunts. They were nurses, and one occupational therapist. And then also, like my grandfather, he did a bunch of things, and one of them was being on a railroad gang. And in the 1920, he was on a work crew down in Southern California. And so also my grandfather, he worked a bunch of jobs, but he was also worked on the railroad in 1920. He was a railroad worker. There was only one other Filipino there at the same time, and they worked on laying track down in Southern California. My favorite thing here at this museum is actually the stories that we've been gathering about the different families across the United States. One of the things that is an important part of Filipino-American history is World War II and the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry that were formed mostly out of California Filipinos. When they heard about, at the same time Pearl Harbor was bombed, so was the Philippines. And the Filipinos here wanted to join and fight for their home country, but they were nationals, they weren't citizens, so they couldn't join the US Army. So the president had to make a special law where they could, and so many of them joined. They had a 1st Filipino Infantry, and then many more, so they had a 2nd Filipino Infantry. Well, I got two uncles that were in one was in the 1st Filipino Infantry, my grandfather's brother, his youngest brother, and then my grandfather's cousin was in the 2nd Filipino Infantry. So I like seeing the pictures of them and knowing the history of what they had to do, training in New Guinea. My uncle had written my mom while he was because because of his age, he had to go into the medical corps. So he was learning how to give shots and stuff at the same time that my mom is learning how to be a nurse. And so they're comparing notes on their patients, and then he's describing how they spent Christmas at his base. And this came on VMail. And VMail, if you guys remember, VMail, they write a letter, it goes through whatever process, and it gets shrunk down to about this size, and it's mimeographed, and then that's what's mailed off to your loved ones with things blacked out, you know, so that they don't reveal where they are. So we've got copies of those letters, so I enjoy reading those things, and we created a 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry exhibit here in the museum. And that's kind of one of the big draws for people coming in, is seeing their uncle or their father up there on the board that we created. And we have medals and swords, the bolo swords. We have because they had training film of them with the bolos, and even though maybe they might not have actually used it over there, but they had these propaganda films that the Army put out, said, hey, check this out. So these are the kind of things that I like here, hearing the personal stories and learning how that fits in with my family's story. That's my great uncle, and then this here is my cousin uncle. I don't know how you say it. He was a cousin. But the V-mail and stuff was what I kept reading these stories that he goes, oh, the USO shows that would come and entertain them, during the war, and the kind of meal they had, because they did get to have turkey, So this is the mass ceremony for them to get their citizenship.
Is that in Fort Worth?
I think, or it was either Campville or.
Just how close is this boat?
Yeah, so I get mixed up on which uncle was in which thing. The person who knows all of that stuff is Alex Fabros Jr. He knows everything. I took pictures of my cousin, uncles, whatever.